Airplanes have always been symbols of progress, freedom, and connection, but every once in a while the skies turn into a battlefield. Whenever the word hijacking is mentioned, people immediately imagine masked terrorists with bombs, guns, and political demands. But the story I'm about to share today is something completely different. This was not about ideology, not about power, not even about escaping prison or politics. This hijacking was planned by a man who was once considered a hero, a man who wore the Navy uniform, flew military jets, and had a family at home. A man whose desperation drove him to risk everything, not for himself, but, in his mind, for his children. But what began as a cold, calculated plan turned into one of the most violent, chaotic battles ever fought inside a cockpit. A battle of strength, of willpower, of survival. And the reason behind it all shocked the entire world. This is the story of FedEx Flight 705, a story of unimaginable courage, human resilience, and the dark side of desperation. The setup. The year was 1994. The world had just entered a new era. The Cold War had ended, the internet was beginning to spread, and air travel was booming. Cargo airlines like FedEx were at the heart of this growth. Based in Memphis, Tennessee, FedEx had become the backbone of global logistics. Every night, its planes carried millions of packages across the world. Among the fleet was the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, a massive 3-engine wide-body jet. It was built for long hauls, capable of carrying more than 80 tons of cargo. To the outside world, it was just another cargo plane. But for the crew inside, it was a world of responsibility. On the morning of April 7, 1994, Flight 705 was scheduled to fly from Memphis to San Jose, California. It was supposed to be routine, a simple cargo haul with only 4 people on board. Captain David Sanders, a 49-year-old veteran pilot with thousands of flight hours. Calm, respected, known for his leadership. First Officer James Tucker, just 42 years old, a former Navy fighter pilot who had flown F-14 Tomcats at supersonic speeds. He was sharp, fearless, and trained to handle high-pressure situations. Flight Engineer Andrew Peterson, 39, quiet and detail-oriented, the man who monitored the systems and made sure the jet stayed healthy. And then, there was the 4th crew member, Auburn Calloway. At 42, Calloway was also a FedEx pilot. On the surface, he was polite, intelligent, and professional. He had once been a Navy pilot himself, highly skilled in aerial maneuvers. But behind the smile, his life was falling apart. The hidden motive Calloway's story begins years earlier. He had served with pride in the U.S. Navy, but after his service, things didn't go as planned. His marriage crumbled, financial troubles mounted, and though he had landed a job at FedEx, he was drowning in debt. Worse still, FedEx had discovered that he had falsified hours on his resume. A termination letter was on the horizon. For Calloway, this wasn't just a job. It was his last lifeline. Losing it meant losing his income, his reputation, and possibly even custody of his children. And so, a terrifying thought began to take shape in his mind. FedEx, like many companies, had a life insurance policy for its employees. Calloway's was worth $5 million. If he were to die in a tragic accident, his children would be taken care of. But for that, the accident had to look real. So he crafted a plan. Board a flight as a jump seat crew member. Kill the other pilots with blunt force weapons to avoid suspicion. Take control of the plane. Crash it in such a way that it appeared to be a tragic accident. Cold, calculated, chilling. Calloway convinced himself he was doing this for his children. But in reality, it meant destroying 3 innocent lives, and risking many more if the plane crashed over a populated area. The boarding. On that fateful afternoon, Calloway arrived at Memphis Airport earlier than the others. He carried a travel bag and a guitar case. To security, it looked harmless. A guitar case wasn't unusual. Inside it was no guitar. Instead, there was a .357 caliber pistol and 2 hammers. The crew arrived shortly afterward. They greeted each other warmly, joked around, and began their pre-flight checks. Tucker noticed something strange. The cockpit voice recorder was off. He flipped it back on. Everything seemed fine. What no one realized was that the cockpit door had been left unlocked, that one small oversight would soon determine life or death. At 3:00 p.m., Flight 705 took off. It climbed smoothly into the sky, reaching an altitude of 18,000 feet. The crew settled into routine, but in the back of the cockpit, Calloway's hands tightened around the hammer. The attack without warning, Calloway struck. He swung the hammer at Peterson's head, cracking his skull. Blood splattered across the cockpit, Before Tucker could react, Calloway smashed him across the jaw, breaking it instantly. Then he lunged at Captain Sanders, raining down blow after blow. Chaos erupted. The cockpit, normally filled with calm voices and steady beeps of instruments, was now a scene of raw violence. All 3 crew members were bleeding heavily. Calloway pulled out the gun and screamed, "Do as I say or I'll kill you!" But the crew did not surrender. The battle for control, First Officer Tucker, despite his fractured skull and broken jaw, grabbed the controls. His military instincts kicked in. He knew the only way to fight back was to make the cockpit an impossible environment for Calloway. He pushed the yoke forward and threw the massive cargo jet into maneuvers it was never designed for. The DC-10 rolled, dove, and climbed at angles beyond its limits. Alarms screamed. Cargo containers shifted violently in the hold. The wings trembled, threatening to rip apart. At one point, Tucker pushed the jet into a near-vertical climb, then suddenly flipped it into a sharp dive. The G-forces pinned everyone to their seats. Calloway was thrown off balance. His gun slipped from his hand. The crew pounced. Despite their injuries, Sanders and Peterson wrestled with Calloway, fists flying, bodies slamming against cockpit panels. It was no longer just a hijacking. It was hand-to-hand combat at 18,000 feet in the sky. The desperate call over the radio, Tucker's strained, bloodied voice cried out, "Memphis! This is Express 705. We've been taken over. We need emergency clearance. Now!" The control tower froze. Controllers stared at each other in disbelief. A hijacking. On a FedEx cargo plane? They cleared runway 36 immediately and called emergency services. Ambulances, fire trucks, and police vehicles raced to position. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, the struggle raged on. Calloway fought like a man possessed. Again and again, he tried to reach for the gun. Again and again, the crew pushed him back. Peterson's face was soaked in blood. Sanders's ear was nearly torn off. Tucker could barely speak with his shattered jaw. But together, they refused to let go. Finally, in a surge of adrenaline, they managed to pin Calloway down and beat him into unconsciousness. But now came an even greater challenge, the impossible landing. The plane was still massively overweight, more than 16 tons above the safe landing limit. At such weight, the landing gear could collapse or the aircraft could burst into flames upon touchdown. Yet Captain Sanders had no choice. He steadied his trembling hands, wiped the blood from his eyes, and lined up with runway 36. Emergency. Crews stood ready, hearts pounding, watching the massive DC-10 approach. The landing gear screeched, tires smoked, the entire jet shuddered under the weight. But somehow, against all odds, Sanders brought the plane down safely. The aircraft skidded down the runway and came to a halt, just 200 meters before the end. Police stormed the jet, dragged the unconscious Calloway away in handcuffs, and rushed the 3 crew members to ambulances. Aftermath. The injuries were horrific. Tucker's skull was fractured and his jaw shattered. Sanders suffered deep wounds and nearly lost his ear. Peterson's head was split open. Doctors later said it was a miracle they survived at all, but they did more than survive. They saved the plane, saved themselves, and prevented what could have been one of the worst aviation tragedies in American history. For their heroism, the 3 men were awarded the Gold Medal of Heroism by the Airline Pilots Association, the highest honor a civilian pilot can receive. Justice for Auburn Calloway was arrested, tried, and convicted. The evidence was undeniable. The weapons, the insurance motive, the testimony of the crew. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Today, he remains behind bars. Once a man who dreamed of the skies, he will never see freedom again. Reflection. Think about it for a moment. 3 men, battered and broken, bleeding and barely conscious, still found the strength to fight back against death itself. Their training, their courage, and above all, their refusal to surrender turned a tragedy into a miracle. And it leaves us with a haunting question. What truly drives a person to such desperation that they would be willing to kill just so their children might live with money? It's a reminder of how fragile the line between love and destruction can be.